Get your hands off her. The kitchen went quiet so fast that the only sound left was the hiss of the prep burners and the distant clink of glassware from the dining room beyond the swing door. Lottie Baines hadn't moved. She was still standing with her back against the stainless steel counter, one hand pressed flat against the cold surface to keep herself upright, her glasses pushed sideways on her face from where Cecily Rudd had shoved her. The inventory binder had fallen to the floor, pages fanned out across the tile like something surrendering. Nobody in the kitchen picked it up. Cecily stood 3 feet away, her manicured hand still raised, chest heaving with righteous indignation, her voice carrying the precise pitch of a woman who had spent years getting away with things. She miscounted the liquor inventory. Again. I've been covering for her incompetence since I got here, and I'm done. That's not what happened. Lottie's voice came out steadier than she felt. I have the ledger. The count is correct. 3 bottles of the Macallan 18 are missing from the back cage. Are you calling me a liar? I'm telling you what the numbers say. The shove had been fast. Lottie hadn't expected it. Nobody had stopped it. The line cook closest to her had looked down at his cutting board. The sous chef had walked to the far end of the kitchen. The server who had witnessed the whole thing, a young woman named Bryn, barely 22, first week on the job, had pressed herself into the corner by the dishwasher and gone very still. That was what hurt more than the impact. Not the shove itself, but the moment after, when Lottie looked around a room full of people and understood that not one of them was going to say a word. Then the swing door opened. Fabian Laird did not raise his voice. He never did. Get your hands off her. He was 41 years old. He had built his empire the way most people build nothing, methodically, ruthlessly, and without apology. His name appeared on 3 legitimate business registrations and 0 criminal records, which was a testament less to innocence than to the quality of the lawyers he kept on retainer. In this city, in the circles that actually mattered, his name was not said casually. He stood in the kitchen doorway in a charcoal suit, no tie, and looked at Cecily Rudd the way a man looks at a problem he is calculating the cost of solving. Mr. Laird. Cecily's voice shifted register completely. I was just addressing a staffing issue. Nothing that concerns. The woman who keeps my books concerns me. He stepped fully into the kitchen. The door swung shut behind him. What happened to her glasses? The room was silent. Lottie reached up and straightened them herself. I'm fine. That wasn't what I asked. His eyes moved to Cecily, then to the server in the corner, then to every person in that kitchen who had chosen to look away. It was a slow inventory, methodical, and it cost each of them something they wouldn't be able to name until later. Tell me, he said quietly, which one of you saw what happened? No one answered for 3 full seconds. Then Bryn, the young server still pressed against the far wall, raised her hand. What followed was quiet and absolute. Fabian asked Lottie to wait in the small office, behind the bar. He did not touch her. He did not speak to her again until the kitchen had been cleared of everyone, except Sayers, his operations man, who appeared from somewhere without being summoned. Sayers had a quality of arriving exactly when needed, like a weather event in a good suit. Lottie sat in the office with the inventory binder in her lap and tried to slow her breathing. She had been at Art Dent for 3 years. She knew what this building was. She wasn't naive about the business she kept books for, the kind where certain numbers were meant to be invisible and others were meant to be very visible. And the skill lay in knowing which was which. She had never asked about the things she wasn't supposed to ask about. She had shown up on time, done her work accurately, kept her mouth shut, and taken up as little space as possible. That last part had become a habit long before she ever walked through the doors of Ardent. She was still sitting very straight, still pressing her back against the chair like she was trying to fold herself smaller, when Fabian came in and closed the door behind him. "You have the ledger," he said. It wasn't a question. She opened the binder and turned it toward him. 3 bottles missing. The entry was written over in a different ink. The original count was correct. Someone changed it and then needed a reason to explain the discrepancy. I was the reason. He looked at the ledger for 30 seconds without speaking. Then he looked at her. "How long have you known?" "I suspected 3 weeks ago. I didn't say anything because I wasn't certain, and because..." She stopped. "Because you weren't sure you'd be believed." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. He studied her face. The place on her cheekbone, where the shove had knocked her glasses sideways, which was beginning to shade faintly pink, and something passed across his expression that was not quite anger, and not quite anything else she had a word for. "You will sit here," he said. "You won't clean up. You won't apologize. You won't go back to work. Understood?" Lottie blinked. In her experience, the instruction after something like this was always some version of "pull yourself together," or "let's not make this bigger than it is." She had been following those instructions for most of her adult life. "Understood," she said. He left. Outside, Sayers was already waiting, with a printed copy of the security logs from the back storage cage. Cecily Rudd was dismissed within the hour. The announcement was made in the dining room, before service, with the full staff assembled. Fabian said it in 4 sentences. He did not raise his voice. He explained that the inventory discrepancy had been traced, that the person responsible had been terminated, and that Ardent's books had always been kept correctly by the person responsible for keeping them. He named Lottie directly. She was standing near the back of the room. She had not expected to be named. Several of her colleagues turned to look at her, and she had to resist the old reflex, the one that told her to step behind whoever was standing nearest, to make herself smaller, to pretend she wasn't the one being talked about. She didn't step back, she stood still. After the staff dispersed to prepare for service, Bryn appeared beside her. "I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner," the young server said. Her voice was thin with guilt. "When she shoved you, I froze. I didn't know what to do." "You spoke up when it mattered," Lottie said. "I should have done it faster." Lottie looked at her. "Next time you will." It was a simple thing to say. She meant it simply. But Bryn's eyes filled, and she nodded. And she went to set her tables with the careful attention of someone who had just decided something about themselves. Life at Ardent shifted after that, in ways that were hard to quantify and easy to feel. Fabian began reviewing the weekly ledger personally, rather than through Sayers. He would stop by the office at the end of a shift, ask a specific question about a specific line item, and stay for the answer longer than the question required. He had, Lottie realized, actually read the summaries she'd been leaving for 3 years, not skimmed them, read them. Because he asked questions that could only be formed by someone who had tracked the numbers over time. "You caught the linen supplier overcharging us," he said one evening, standing in the office doorway with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow. 8 months ago. You adjusted the payment and left a note, but didn't flag it to me directly. It was a small amount. I handled it. It wasn't the amount." She waited. "You were testing whether anyone was actually reading what you wrote," he said. The accuracy of this was uncomfortable. "I was confirming my own figures," she said carefully. He almost smiled. It was a very small almost, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. "You've been underpaid since the day you arrived." "The contract." "I know what the contract says." He set a folder on the desk beside her. "That's been corrected." She didn't open it in front of him. After he left, she sat for a long moment looking at the folder, then at the door he'd closed behind him, then opened the folder. The number inside it was enough to make her sit very still for a while. Sayers, for his part, noticed things. It was his professional function, and he was exceptional at it. He noticed that his employer now reviewed the weekly ledger before Sayers had a chance to. He noticed that on the evenings Fabian was present, the route from the private dining room to the exit had, without any stated reason, begun passing through the corridor that led to the bookkeeper's office. He compiled these observations and decided, wisely, that they were none of his business. What he did not anticipate was the night a regular client named Boyd Stanhope, a commercial developer who funneled money through Ardente and believed this arrangement gave him social standing, chose to confront Lottie at the bar. She had come out to drop off a report for the evening manager. Stanhope was at the bar with 2 business contacts, drinking something that had made him generous with his opinions. "You're the bookkeeper," he said loudly, in the way that drunk men announce things they want an audience for. "Heard there was some whole thing with the inventory a while back. Somebody got fired." "That matter was resolved," Lottie said. She was already turning to leave. "Hey, I'm talking to you." He reached out and caught her wrist. The grip was casual, proprietary, the kind of touch that communicated she didn't get to walk away. "I just want to know if the help around here is reliable, or if I need to be watching myself." His companions laughed. Lottie went very still. It was a specific kind of stillness, the kind she had learned years ago, in offices and hallways and dinner parties, where some version of this had happened before, the stillness of a person making themselves invisible because invisibility had historically been safer than the alternative. She was not in any of those old places. But the body remembers what the mind would rather forget. "The help," she said carefully, "keeps accurate books and minds her own business. I'd suggest the same." Stanhope's expression hardened. "That's some nerve for her." He looked her up and down with deliberate slowness, the kind of look designed to make a person aware of every inch of themselves. "Well, you know what I mean." The words he didn't say were louder than the ones he did. The bar had gone quiet in the way the kitchen had gone quiet weeks earlier. The bartender, 2 servers, a cocktail waitress, all of them suddenly finding something urgent to look at that wasn't this. Then Fabian was there. He came from the direction of the private dining room and moved with the particular quality of a man who has decided exactly what he is going to do before he arrives at the place where he does it. He did not hurry. He did not need to. "Take your hand off her." Stanhope dropped Lottie's wrist. His companions straightened in their seats. "Fabian," he recovered quickly, forcing a laugh. "I was just having a conversation with your—" "I heard what you were having." Fabian looked at Lottie first. "Are you all right?" She nodded once. Her jaw was tight. He turned back to Stanhope with the patience of a man for whom anger was a thing to be deployed, precisely, never wasted. "You've been a client of this establishment for 4 years. "That's right, and I think." Past tense. Fabian straightened his cuff. "You're no longer welcome here. Your accounts will be settled and your arrangement terminated. Sayers will have the documentation prepared before you leave tonight." Stanhope stared at him. "You can't be serious. Over the fact that you put your hands on my employee and then used your mouth to finish what your hands started." "Yes, completely serious." The room was very quiet. Stanhope looked around for support and found none. His 2 companions had developed the posture of people who had somewhere else to be. Sayers materialized at his elbow with his inevitable timing, and Stanhope was escorted out of Ardente without further discussion. Fabian looked at the bar staff that had once again stood silent through the whole thing. He said nothing about it. He didn't have to. The observation itself was the message. Then he turned to Lottie, who was still standing with her report folder pressed flat against her chest, like a shield she hadn't realized she was holding. "Walk with me," he said. He took her to the small courtyard behind the building, a narrow rectangle of old brick and a single iron bench used by kitchen staff for smoke breaks, and by no one else. The city noise was muffled out here. The air was cool. She sat on the bench. He stood near the far wall, hands in his pockets, looking at the strip of sky visible between the buildings. "You've been here 3 years," he said finally. 3 years and 4 months. And tonight wasn't the first time something like that has happened to you. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. No, not even close. He turned to look at her. "Tell me." She almost didn't. The habit of not telling was so deeply ingrained that it moved through her like a reflex before she could decide anything consciously. Telling meant taking up space. Telling meant believing your own experience deserved someone else's attention. She had spent a long time deciding it didn't. But he had asked, and he was looking at her like he intended to wait as long as it took. So she told him. She told him about the accounting firm before this one. Good salary, solid reputation, where she had been passed over for promotion twice, while men with her credentials and worse accuracy were advanced. Where her manager had explained, with genuine regret in his voice, the client sometimes formed impressions based on presentation, and that was simply the reality of a client-facing environment. She had understood exactly what he meant, and quit the following week. She told him about the year before that, when she had been engaged to a man she loved, who had loved her too until his professional world expanded, and her body stayed the same size it had always been, and those two things had proven incompatible in ways he struggled to explain and eventually stopped trying to. The venue had been booked. The invitations had been addressed but never mailed. She told him she had spent the years since then making herself as close to invisible as possible. Good work, no trouble, no requests, no expectations. She had become very skilled at it. She was not crying. She was past the kind of pain that produces tears and into the kind that sits in the chest like old furniture, heavy, familiar, occupying space you've simply built your life around. He listened without interrupting, without pivoting to solutions or offering reassurances that would have cost him nothing and meant less. When she finished, the courtyard was quiet for a long moment. "I've been watching you work for 3 years," he said. "You caught things that 3 people before you missed. You flagged a compliance issue in the licensing paperwork 8 months before it would have become a problem, and filed the correction yourself, and left me a 1-line note. You took less than an hour to recover from the worst situation this staff had seen in years, and then you comforted the youngest employee on the floor instead of accepting the comfort you were owed." Lottie looked at her hands. "What I'm telling you," he said, "is that the people who convinced you to make yourself small were not evaluating what you actually are. They were protecting themselves from it." She looked up. "You make people aware of their own inadequacy," he said. "That's deeply uncomfortable for people who have decided their inadequacy should go unexamined. So they found other things to focus on." He paused. "That's a failure of their character. It has nothing whatsoever to do with yours." She held his gaze for a long moment. No one had ever said this to her. Not like this, with the precision of someone who had thought it through and meant every word of it. "I don't always feel like that's true," she said quietly. "I know." His voice was the quietest she had ever heard it. That's exactly what they were counting on. The city hummed somewhere beyond the brick walls. A siren moved through the distance and faded. "Why did you hire me?" she asked. 3 years ago. My resume had a gap. 2 of my references were from jobs where I hadn't stayed more than a year. He was quiet for a moment. "Your work sample was flawless. You found 2 errors in the test ledger I gave you. One I planted intentionally, and one that was an actual mistake I had made myself and not caught. You circled both in pencil, noted the probable source of each, suggested a correction for each. You didn't make a performance of it. You just found the truth in the numbers and marked it. She thought about that. And, he said, you looked at me during the interview like you were deciding something. Most people who sit across from me have already decided. They just want to know if I'll say yes. He paused. You were deciding if I was worth working for. She almost smiled. You passed. So did you. He looked away from her, toward the narrow strip of sky. I should have told you that much sooner. 3 months later, Ardente was different in ways that were hard to quantify and easy to feel. Fabian had brought in a new floor manager named Wanda Haywood, who had the twin qualities of being exceptional at her job and genuinely kind to the people who worked for her. The staff moved differently under her management, less braced, less cautious. People arrived a few minutes early now instead of exactly on time. Small things, the kind that add up. Lottie had been given an office with a window. The raise had been followed by a title, Director of Finance and Operations. She had accepted it with the same quiet composure she applied to most things, and then gone home and stood in her apartment for a long time, thinking about what it meant to be given a title that simply matched the work she had always already been doing. She and Fabian had dinner twice a week now. Not at Ardente. At a place with no connection to his business. A corner restaurant in a neighborhood where no one paid attention to anyone, where the food was good and the booths were private, and the conversation had learned to run long without either of them noticing. He told her things she suspected he told almost no one, about the choices he had made when he was young enough to believe that power was a destination rather than a condition. About the weight of accountability when the people under your authority had no safety net but you, about his mother, who had died believing he would eventually become something she could explain at church. She told him things she had stopped telling people years ago, because the telling had always cost more than the understanding was worth. One evening, walking back from dinner through the kind of neighborhood where the streetlights are warm and no one is in a hurry, she stopped on the sidewalk and said his name. He stopped and turned. I used to think, she said, that if I changed enough things about myself, eventually I'd become someone easy to love. The right size, the right presentation, the right amount of presence in a room. She looked at him steadily. I changed a lot of things. It didn't work. He took one step back toward her. No, it wouldn't. You look at me like there's nothing I'm supposed to be changing. There isn't. She held that for a moment, let it settle the way things settle when they're simply true. Then maybe, she said, I should stop waiting for the version of myself that's worth showing up for. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, or you could consider that version has been present for some time. You simply weren't given a reliable mirror. She laughed, a surprised, real laugh, the kind that arrives before you have a chance to manage it. He reached out and took her hand, simply, without drama. The way someone reaches for something they have decided belongs in their hand. They stood on the sidewalk while the city moved around them, unhurried and indifferent to the fact that something was beginning here that was neither dramatic nor sudden, but was, in the way of things built carefully over time, remarkably strong. Dinner Thursday, she said. Yes. You're going to try to pay again. I always try. And I'm going to stop you. You always do. His thumb moved once across the back of her hand. It's one of the things I rely on. She looked at him. He looked back. And for the first time in longer than she could accurately name, Lottie Baines stood on a sidewalk at night and did not feel like a woman trying to take up less space than she had been given. She felt simply and completely like herself, which turned out, in the end, to be more than enough.